Well, thanks. So hopefully that little movie gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're doing and what we're going to be doing over the next few years. How we're going to be spending $25 billion on the project in Azerbaijan and Georgia, and then a further $15 to $20 billion on different pipeline projects in Turkey and in Europe. But I actually wanted to start tonight not with this future project, but with a story 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, back in the 19th century. Back in the 19th century, there were two places in the world that the oil industry was beginning, and they were on opposite sides of the planet. One was here in Texas. The other was on the other side of the world in Azerbaijan. And what's extraordinary is in these two countries that on the face of it had so little in common, the same things were happening. A largely agricultural economy was being transformed by the discovery of oil. Out in Azerbaijan, they hand-dug their first wells with spades, and they used to pull the oil up to the surface in buckets. And they'd use it, just like they did here, for heating and for some forms of lighting. And there weren't many people who moved between the two places. And in general, in Azerbaijan, they imported people from Europe to actually help them dig these wells and help them develop their oil industry and do things like build refineries based on the experience that was being developed in Texas. And amongst the people that helped them were a family called the Nobels. And some of you might have heard of the surname Nobel, famous today for the Nobel Peace Prize. And this same family that went on to develop the Nobel Peace Prize and then the other Nobel Prizes were responsible 150 years ago in Azerbaijan for the development of the oil industry. So if you ever wondered how they got all that money to keep this prize going year after year after year, they based their family fortune on oil in Azerbaijan and on gunpowder. So on those unusual beginnings, oil and gunpowder, they built their fortune that enabled them to set up the Nobel Prizes that last to this day and still carry on being given today. So there we are 100 years ago in Azerbaijan. And this is a very poor, very remote part of the world. Not many people have heard of it. And yet the oil money starts coming in. And in this remote part of the world, on the shores of this sea called the Caspian Sea, they start to build grand buildings. And they model their buildings on Paris in France. And they build these wonderful buildings made out of marble, based on designs that they've seen in pictures from Paris. And they bring architects across from Europe to build these incredible buildings. And they build this city centre. And the country gets richer and richer and richer. And then something terrible happens. Around about the turn of the century, 1915, the Soviet Union gets formed. And instead of the money benefiting the people in Azerbaijan, all the money is taken from Azerbaijan into Russia, and it's used for the development of the Soviet Union through the 20th century. So this country that had started so rich at the start of the 20th century ends up becoming more and more poor as the oil comes out of the ground and is turned into banknotes, but all those banknotes go to Moscow rather than locally. So the 20th century goes on, and all these beautiful buildings that were built are allowed to decay, and the country gets poorer and poorer. And then we come to the Second World War, so 60 years ago now, 1940s, and Russia at the time, the Soviet Union, is fighting Nazi Germany, and the oil that it uses in its tanks comes out of the oil fields in Azerbaijan. So the oil is taken out, it's refined, and it's put into the tanks that go on to fight Nazi Germany. And Hitler works out that if he can reach Azerbaijan, if he in turn can send his tanks to Azerbaijan, then he can cut off the Soviet Union's oil supply and all those tanks that are fighting Hitler on the Eastern Front versus the American tanks that are coming in on Hitler on the Western Front. All those tanks will run out of oil. So Hitler launches this huge effort to overcome Azerbaijan. And at one point he cuts off the oil supply from Azerbaijan to the Soviet Union. And what they do is they get loads and loads of railway wagons and they fill it with oil. And no one had ever done this before. They worked out that oil was lighter than water. And instead of taking them on the railroads that were now overcome by the Nazi forces, instead the train took them to the harbour, and they pulled this train with all its wagons full of oil off the end of the harbour into the sea and tugged it across the Caspian Sea to feed the tanks that were fighting Nazi Germany. And my counterpart in Azerbaijan is a man called Hoshbak Yusufzadeh,